So hey everybody, welcome to episode 295 of the More Than Just Code podcast. My name is Tim Mitchell and I am in Toronto, Ontario, and I'm joined once again by Jaime Lopez Jr. in Seattle, Washington.
How's it going?
And we have Mark Rubin on the line in San Jose, California.
Hello.
Alrighty. Okay, so yeah, we'll just start off with some fact check. Jaime mentioned last week the NHS, or National Health Service, is what I think you guessed that that's what it was, but that was in fact what it is. It's the publicly funded healthcare system in the United Kingdom. And further on, we were discussing Bluetooth, and I had said 9 meters and you had said 30 meters, and turns out that we were both sort of right, because there's a class 1 range that's 20 to 30 meters, or 66 to 98 feet for those of you driving at home, and class 2 range is 5 to 9. So I was sort of thinking, I guess I was thinking about class 2 and you were thinking about class 1, right? So yeah, 16 to 33 feet for the class 9. Because I mean, I kind of wonder, like, you know, when I separate myself from my phone, like the watch and the phone, are they talking Bluetooth or are they talking wireless? Do you know that? You guys know?
That's a good question, because if you're on the same Wi-Fi network, I think the watch can still do things, but I don't know if everything is routed through there.
Yeah, because you know, like if I leave my phone here on the first floor and I go upstairs to the second floor or third floor, my watch doesn't know where my phone is, you know, sort of thing. And yet my house door lock can work from here, which is like, you know, 30 or 40 feet away from where I am currently. So who knows?
Yeah, I think the devices have gotten pretty good at kind of going back and forth between the two in a lot of cases.
Right. And we were discussing Denise Crosby, whose father is, she's named after her father, Dennis, who was Bing Crosby's son. So yeah, technically she is not technically, she is Bing Crosby's granddaughter. But because she lived with her mother, who was estranged from her father, and all kinds of lawsuits and stuff ensued. She never actually met her grandfather when he died when she was 19 years old. So even though she was related to Bing Crosby, she never actually met him in person. And I'll let you take the Whittaker one, Jaime.
Yeah, this one came up because very similar to the unanswered question here about Sidney Crosby, the NHL great, and his relationship or not with the Denise Crosby and Bing Crosby family. We had posited humorously, I don't think anybody took this seriously, but you know, we have facts and details for this reason. So Rob Whittaker, friend of the show, and we talked about his book, The Developing Inclusive Mobile Apps, last time or the time before. We'd say, I think it might have been you, Tim. You might have said, wonder if he's related. And he has given us the real details and says, unfortunately, not related to Jodi Whittaker. She spells her name wrong with a double T that I had not realized. Thanks for the shout out.
So it's funny because a friend of mine from Britain says, you know, when I question about driving on which side of the road they drive on, he says they drive on the correct side of the road.
And as long as we're doing facts, so they have to look up, you know, how does Jodi Whittaker actually spell her name? Like, you know, just fact checking the fact check. And I said, I am about a year older than Jodi Whittaker, so I am older than the doctor. Yeah.
Wow, what do you know? So speaking of, since you mentioned Sidney Crosby, I think we have to, I don't know if you guys have heard, but we have to say that our thoughts go out to the folks in Nova Scotia, which is where Sidney Crosby is from. We just had the largest mass killing in Canadian history happened this weekend, and so, you know, we're thinking of you guys out there struggling with that thought. Anyway, okay, so do you have any Ask MTJC, Jaime?
I didn't see any, and I was going to put that link in there until I saw that you'd put it in the fact check, which it arguably belongs in, so that's good.
Yeah, well, he didn't technically give us the Ask MTJC hashtag, so not officially an Ask MTJC at that point. Alrighty, Jaime, why don't you start off with the follow-up?
Yeah, I'm kind of been thinking more about the hype cycles thing that we were talking about in relation to sort of the origins of this show and the sort of web hype cycle and how that sort of 10-year life cycle seemed to sort of work, not from a utility standpoint. And somebody pointed out, hey, like, what about Objective-C? It's been around for decades. And that's true, right? And it had its own cycle. I think that there was definitely, you know, one that worked out pretty well for mobile, right? You know, iOS development in particular, where it was like, you know, indie developers, super hot. If you had an idea, people were throwing millions of dollars at you. And then it became more and more saturated over time with the number of people who were involved. It started getting to a more sort of professional level where the big companies were starting to play. And that was roughly around the 5-year standpoint, at which point it just gets more and more difficult, right? And we certainly talked about it at the very early stages of this very podcast on sort of the difficulties there and how things had changed. It was sort of more like, yeah, everybody assumes that you're going to have a mobile app. It's not, like a unique thing, right? There's no more like, there's an app for that. It's like, well, yeah, obviously there is, right? Of course. So this isn't something that needs to be advertised. It's just truth.
Or like, why isn't there an app for that if there isn't one, right?
Yeah, it's quite the opposite now.
Yeah.
And I think that, something I've been wondering about is, are we seeing something kind of similar with Swift? So Swift started, as far as we were publicly available, in June of 2014 when we got a chance to see it. And here we are, almost, it's April now, but, we're pretty close to June. So we're almost 6 years in. And how would I analyze what was happening just prior to SwiftUI being and Combined being announced? I would say, yeah, Swift was sort of hitting the, it was super hyped. Everybody was like, oh my gosh, let's check this out. Conferences were starting to be created specifically around Swift and not necessarily around iOS or Mac development, right? Swift on the server, Swift on other platforms sort of thing. And then that sort of seemed to slow down as each year went by, right? And you get into that sort of midpoint of my hypothetical 10-year cycle of like, yeah, you sort of crest at the 5-year point. But I think you can end up with sort of secondary bumps that sort of extend this out. So I think very similar to the way that the iOS cycle, pick a year, whether you started in 2007 or 2008. I mean, clearly you would have hit the 10-year mark by 2018, which means that midpoint is somewhere around 2012 to 2013. But you see another sort of secondary bump happen, sort of extending the cycle with Swift. And think even as Swift started to become more mature and people are just like, yeah, Swift is just another tool that we love and enjoy, but we're not necessarily fanatical about it. I sort of wonder if SwiftUI and Combine help renew the life for Swift, right? So we end up with like another maybe 5-year sort of shift to that cycle where now you are starting to see, granted, we're in the middle of a pandemic as this episode is being recorded for historians when they come back and listen to this. Inability to meet and greet other human beings notwithstanding, I do think that the sort of content you would see and excitement around this technology benefits from having something new to work with in the form of SwiftUI and Combined, where Swift will get another like little bit of secondary, a little bit of more lipstick and hairspray sort of thing, making it more palatable for making conferences around this sort of thing, having people be excited and not just be like, oh yeah, whatever, we'll check that out later. But be like, no, I actually have to consume this content soon. So we'll see. Yeah,
it's interesting. I wonder, so this weekend I was working in my old, legacy app, which is written in Objective-C, but I was adding some new features to the app, and so of course I'm writing the new stuff in Swift, and I was just sitting here thinking as you're saying that, I wonder, can we call Objective-C from SwiftUI? I wonder I guess we can if we use that Obj-C thing, right? Or is that vice versa? That's vice versa, right?
Well, you'd have to make sure it's whatever you're doing is interoperable with Objective-C from Swift, and then if you're doing
types and stuff like that,
and then if you're doing anything related to non-SwiftUI framework like UIKit, you'd have to do the wrapping to get that into the UI presentable or whatever it's called, right?
Yeah, because in a lot of early things that I've seen in SwiftUI, people are still writing native Swift, right? Like if you're writing a structure or whatever to be used, or if you're making a model, you don't necessarily have to write the model in SwiftUI. You can write it in Swift and just use it in SwiftUI, right? So there's a bit of like you said, there's a bit of
SwiftUI still is Swift, right? The language is still Swift.
Yes.
So all of the the structs and class constructs are still there. It just has some special syntax for setting up the UI, your views. Yeah.
So interesting.
But I do think going forward, if there was anything added to SwiftUI that was valid Swift but not valid Objective-C,
right?
Like it wouldn't cross over the interop.
Well, like a function builder, for example. Yeah, you couldn't do your top level SwiftUI, define a Swift view and then a SwiftUI view, and then have your body method where you can just list your components. You couldn't do that level in Objective-C because that just doesn't exist. That syntax just doesn't exist. But in theory, you could have everything inside that, inside that, point to objects that had Objective-C inside them. I mean, there's no fundamental reason why you couldn't. It's just that one syntax layer just doesn't exist in Objective-C.
Yeah. So you're saying that you could have, say, you could put like a SwiftUI interface on top of an Objective-C code base, you think?
Oh, sure. Absolutely you could. Yeah. In fact, you could have all of your SwiftUI views if you wanted to. I wouldn't recommend this, but you could have all of your SwiftUI views be UIKit views wrapped in UIView representable, and have those UIKit views all written in Objective-C, and then just wrap them in UIView representable.
Okay.
Sure, why not? Like I said, I wouldn't recommend that, but you could. Seems like you could.
Yeah. So where does that put us with the definition of hype cycles in Swift, Jaime? What's the TLDR?
It gets complicated from the way long ago sort of observation I had of like what ended up happening to the web as a technology. And even though we don't really have great terms for this, if we use the Web 1.0 and Web 2.0 to sort of delineate the shifts there, you had that first really big, like, wow, anything that can be on the web, will be on the web. And even if it's not that great of an experience, and we're talking, pre-Ajax type stuff, you would see it on there. And then it's a little complicated history-wise because you ended up having the .com crash change a lot of, what people were doing around that. But there were still people doing stuff with the technology, and it sort of had its time in the sun, right? You can very arbitrarily say around the 93 to 95 starting point to the around 2003 to 2005 ending point for that. And around, right off the tail end of that, you have the Web 2.0 in 2006-ish sort of time frame. And that added sort of a whole new life to web technologies, which actually continues even to this day, right? You had things sort of make their way through there with regard to the old Web 2.0 technologies. You could draw the line around 2015, 2016 when that became less interesting than I don't know what to call it because there already was a terminology for Web 3.0. So let's just go with reactive technologies like React, like Vue.js, like a whole bunch of other things where they started up around that 2015-ish, 2016-ish time. And I guess we're about halfway through that. So we'll see what ends up happening with regard to what is the next bigger thing. So these aren't necessarily going to be progressive. They're not necessarily going to be completely whatever the opposite is of non-overlapping or overlapping. Right, they're not going to be discrete per se. It's fuzzy, and 10 years is a really, really arbitrary line, right? It could be 7.5 years, it could be 11.2 years. Sort of the drawing lines to sort of see phases, almost like generations, if you will, is how I've liked to look at it from when I'm looking at the hype cycle and what's going on. And so it's very non-scientific. It's not meant to be any sort of rule of law or rule of nature sort of thing. So it's just fun to analyze it and see, what has happened and try to predict, what is going to happen next.
Okay, cool. Well, should we move on to our next story?
Yeah, it's yours, so segue to yourself.
Sure, yeah. So the first story I have posted here is a leaked iPhone 12 Pro schematic, and this is a video on the Mac Rumors site. And you can see if you scroll down, there's like a 3D render or 3D drawing of what is supposed to be the next phone, and it looks very similar to an iPhone 5 in terms of the style. It's got the aluminum band around, or metal band of some type around, and you can see the brakes and the metal for the iPhone 4 style antennas, and some sort of connection at the bottom. And this was uncovered as a 3D printable model for the manufacturing of cases and things like that, right? And so some of these guys in the videos have taken this piece and run madly through through a tech video here on what they're thinking the iPhone 12 is going to be, a 6.7-inch OLED screen, and they've printed it out and talked about how slick it is, and just a bit comical from my perspective as somebody who owns a 3D printer. Must be an amazing printer they've got if they can really sort of get the sense of how the new phone is going to feel. But yeah, it's interesting that they're basically taking this apart, and they're surmising that there's going to be a LiDAR camera on the back, because the camera section is sort of that squared off style that we have on the current iPad Pro that just came out. The antenna breaks are thicker, so they're thinking that it might include some 5G handset hardware. And
are there any guidelines on how it's supposed to be held?
That's why I brought the iPhone 4, right? You got to make sure you get the meat of your thumb doesn't cover the antenna hole. Yeah, it looks interesting that to me it looks like it looks like the lightning connector on the bottom is offset a bit too in this drawing that they've posted here. So, and they're also talking about the glass back for again, I'm not sure how they're getting that sort of from this 3D thing, and in the model that they printed, the notch area comes out a little narrower than the current iPhone 10 10R 10s scale. It gets a little less, not as wide. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But so it's just interesting that they've taken this apart. I don't know if you guys watched the video at all, but just sort of thinking this is where the iPhone 12 Pro is going to go. A little thinner than the current iPhone 11 Pro. So that's I guess another good thing. They're also guessing that and this is, I'm not sure where they get this leak from, that the logic board is going to be smaller and the battery is going to be more or less square within the lower part of the body, so that currently the battery kind of occupies space with some of the what do you call them, those engine things that vibrate.
Taptic engine.
Taptic engine, yeah, taptic engine they call it, I think, right? Apple. Yep. Interesting theories. Again, I guess in this era we're kind of getting leaks all the time, so a lot of this stuff turns out to be true, right?
Yep.
Or close to true.
But one thing that's kind of interesting, actually quite interesting, is that it's still a Lightning connector. It's not a USB-C connector. Yeah. If we can believe that.
Well, I mean, the iPhone SE just came out with a Lightning connector too, right?
Yeah, but that's the low-end one, So
I guess so.
The high-end one, you might think that it would have a USB-C.
Don't know.
One day
does the
they'll make that change.
iPad Pro have a USB-C?
The iPad Pro does. Yep.
Yes,
it does. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it does.
Oh, but all bets are off until Apple ships something, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I'm kind of first take is there. If you didn't get the trypophobia response, that is the fear of holes from sort of the three circles that they had before. The fourth one seems like it's just leaning right into that. So that's something to consider. The other thing that I think is interesting in a why is this is the one fewer speaker holes on one side of the speaker grill.
Yeah,
I don't fully get that. It's sort of a weird thing for them to do, to have asymmetry. But I'm a little surprised that they would go this route. In this edition is the new colors, including light blue, violet, and light orange, which strike me as more of an S-year change to make. Right? So people know you have the new device, but it looks physically the same. But I'm not going to turn it on. I don't know if the violet's going to look quite like what they show here. I don't know if that's a coincidence. I'm hoping it's more of a deep purple rain kind of thing that I've been championing as an idea for a very long time on this very show. I'm
deep purple
generally
rain. Is that
deep purple
80s
rain.
pop music or 70s prog rock, heavy metal prog rock? Kind of a combination of the two.
the portmanteau of those two things. Yeah. I mean, I've generally been I've been buying the I think they call it silver. It's basically the white iPhone. I've been buying that for like a very long time, ever since the iPhone 5. But I might be convinced if it's a decent color of purple, like a Prince color of purple, if folks were getting that before.
Yeah, they were saying too that there's going to be sort of a blue color going away from the midnight green that they came out with for the last iPhone 11. So I'm not sure where they get these color theories from, right? But they seem to be pretty confident about it in the presentation of this video, right? So,
I'm due for an upgrade, so they could have a lump of coal. I'm probably going to end up buying it, so I can get my pennies ready.
There was one interesting thing they talk about, this slot on the back. I think I call it a smart connector that's on the side of the iPad Pros that help it connect to the smart keyboards and stuff. So I'm not sure why that is there, but that makes me think that perhaps they're going to go to having some other, maybe a keyboard or something that could be used with these phones. Although know why. They're kind of small. Hard to say. Well, the other big rumor this week, of course, this is a huge rumor, and it kind of like lit up for this came out yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago. That according to leaker John Prosser, according to his tweet, he says he's sort of pulled apart the iPadOS 14. I guess is in beta currently. Is it in beta? I'm not sure, but apparently it has references to an Xcode. So he's thinking that he's pretty confident that Xcode is going to come to the iPad in I guess in June when iPadOS 14 ships. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Curious too. I was thinking about that today when I was looking at this, because obviously people are sort of saying, well, it'll guess their best guesses as to what it'll be. Like, is it going to be like a sort of souped up Swift Playgrounds? Will it only allow you to develop for iOS? Because I mean, how could you develop for a Mac on this? I guess is the question. And then, which made me think again about our friend over there called Objective-C. Will you be able to use Objective-C natively in Xcode? What do you guys think of Xcode on the iPad?
I think it's something we've been talking about for a long time, and it would be great if it actually happens.
I think to temper enthusiasm a little bit, because what I fear is I don't want to see what people sort of projected and expected when Adobe brought Photoshop to the iPad to end up happening to Xcode, right? So just to do my part to say, all right, if this does end up being true, it is definitely not going to be a one-to-one mapping with whatever you're using on your MacBook right now, right? Let's just say that it can't possibly handle every... I mean, Tim, you talked about Mac, but like, what about tvOS, right? Like, how are you going to have like a 5K monitor representation and make that work reasonably well on an iPad? I don't know. And maybe the answer is for some of these that it won't have, certainly at day one, but maybe not ever a one-to-one mapping. I do think it is possible for it to be fairly useful for certain cases. Like I would expect it to support Swift, in particular SwiftUI, pretty well, right? Because you're basically writing code, text for the most part, and they've got their new keyboard attachment that works pretty well. And what limited manipulation you would want to do with something a little bit more fine-grained than touch targets, well, it kind of makes sense that they have brought out in a point release a rather substantial upgrade to the pointer mechanisms, right? And being able to handle the mouse so much more effectively. So that sort of feels like, oh, that was setting the stage for iOS 14 and Xcode. So that sort of jives with the idea there. But I don't think that means that you will necessarily be fiddling around with zibs and outlets and other things, right? Unless there's a lot of help to go with there. So I feel like it still needs to be similar to Swift Playgrounds, where it still needs to be reasonably usable, even if slightly clunky, with touch targets, even if you do have the much superior mouse-based interface for like when you really want to get into nitty-gritty details. So that's like a real hand-wavy way of saying like I don't know if it will support things like Objective-C. I don't know if it will support like CocoaPods and Carthage. I would guess it would support Swift Package Manager because, of course, why not, right? Like that's the newer hotness and it works better. So I would look at it as a maybe not bringing along a lot of the sort of legacy things that Xcode has brought on over the years on the Mac, because it's a very different sort of use case. It might add on those things in the future in some nifty way, but I would expect it to be not quite a beefed up Swift Playgrounds, but a more toned down Xcode, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the analogy to Photoshop is interesting too. I just opened my Photoshop on my iPad here and noticed that they still don't have Bezier tools, which is an example of a shortcoming in the Photoshop product. They're also talking, I was just looking at what's new coming up, and they're also bringing in smart objects, which is another sort of convenience in Photoshop that makes kind of fun to work with and convenient. Like you can have references to things, and you don't have to have them edited directly in the current document you're working in. And so taking that analogy, like you said, into where we're going to be with Xcode. I mean, Xcode is the utility knife of a lot of development. You can write. Most of us, for the most part, write Mac or iOS apps with the tools that they've given us. But you can also use Xcode for a number of things. The other thing that Xcode brings, and it gets better every year, is their integration with GitHub and Bitbucket and things like that, right? For source control. How is that going to work on an iPad, right? Mind you, that's just, you're just pushing and pulling, small files. But what about things like CocoaPods, and what about, other things that, what's that, Carthage? Is that another?
Yeah, Carthage is the other one that I...
Yeah, so I mean, those kind of things, like how are they going to work within an iPad? I've edited an episode of Spotcast on my iPad using the Ferrite app, and it was okay. The sound quality didn't come out anywhere near as good as I would get in Logic, but in some ways it was a lot faster to edit within using the pen and all the sort of touch conveniences of an iPad. Again, that's another point too, is like since I've been working from home for the last 4 weeks or 5 weeks, I have got my Logitech keyboard out here, and I am using my iPad with keyboard commands, and it's very Mac-like in a lot of ways. I can do quick app switching. I can do Sherlock type searching. That kind of stuff, all kinds of things that I copy and paste and things like that escape key and all that nonsense that I have on my iPad or ability to use, right? But but they'd have to make an Xcode for iPad work in just tablet mode. Like how do you work with that when you're just using the virtual keyboard, right? You don't have a physical keyboard like I have now. So there's going to have to be some give and take if Xcode does come to the iPad, right? You're not going to be able to do everything that you could do on a Mac with Xcode in the iPadOS, right? It's going to be like a watered down version, right?
I'm wondering about some just more fundamental things, like how's the simulator going to work? Are they going to have a simulator running on the iPad? I mean, I guess they could use the new split screen feature to do that, I guess. But will you be able to deploy to an actual device? Will you be able to plug I suppose, from with USB-C to Lightning cable, it's physically possible now, whereas Lightning to Lightning just didn't exist, ever.
But you have wireless. Don't forget.
You do have wireless
debugging.
Yeah, that's true. You do have wireless debugging. That's true.
Yeah, and I've got a Lightning to USB connector that I use on my current iPad, right? Because I have the 2015 iPad Pro, right, first gen, and with the Lightning connector, I can connect a USB. So it is theoretically possible for me to tether my phone off of my iPad and build to it,
right? From a physical connection point of view, yeah. But it's something that's never been done by us before, at least by developers before, to be able the ability to connect two iOS devices directly together through a wire, right? You've never done that before, so that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, other than the USB thing that I've got in my hand, right? So because the iPadOS does support USB, right? Like I guess it's a mass storage connection, right? From that point of view.
Oh, I see. You're using it you are actually plugging your iPhone into your iPad and using it for storage.
Currently I use this USB for MIDI out off my iPad into my Mac, for instance, right? But it's conceivable, since you can plug in the new iPad Pros, and this one you can plug a thumb drive in, right? Like I could put a thumb drive on this USB, plug it into my Mac and access it. I'm theorizing, but I know that they can do that on the USB-C thumb drive on the new iPad Pros, right? So it's conceivable that they've got the sort of mechanism to do communication with mass storage devices, which technically an iPhone is, because you're dumping code down to it, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it's possible to do that. And there are also the couple of guesses here in this article about whether you're going to be talking to a Mac to do, like we were talking about a couple weeks ago, that the Mac would actually be would handle the heavy lifting, right? So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if something does come to pass. It's like as Jaime sort of said at the beginning of this section here, the proviso is don't expect it to be a full-blown Xcode, right?
Yeah, I think you'll be setting yourself up for disappointment if you think it's one-to-one. And I think it's better to look at it as additive, as in, what did you have before? Nothing. Yeah. And now you have a whole lot of something, even if it's not everything you would want.
Yeah. It reminds me of the story like when I was walking down the sidewalk with my wife about 5 or 6 years ago, or even more. No, it must have been 12 years ago. I had a BlackBerry in my hand, and I was complaining about how bad the browser was on the BlackBerry. And she said, "Look, you're walking down the street and you're on the internet. Shut up."
Yeah. I do think builds would be kind of painfully slow on the iPad for anything, any kind of reasonably sized project.
Yeah. I wonder if they'll have been working on some sort of enhanced incremental build, which they'll be like, they'll talk about it on iPad and be like, and of course it's even faster on Mac OS because we can take these same, like I can already see Craig Federighi saying that, right? Like, of course we've made these same improvements for Mac OS, so it works on traditional Xcode as well. And we've added a delete derived data right to your touch bar because why not?
That's a great point. Like, how do you go in and do that, and how do you install simulators? And well, mind you, remember the talk on Xcode a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, where they were doing a debugging talk, and so they debugged Xcode, debugging Xcode. Did you remember that talk? So
I remember that talk.
Yeah.
It's kind of meta to be debugging Xcode in Xcode, but yeah.
I guess the one thing you would not be able to do, I guess, without jailbreaking is the fecal transplant thing that we talked about for getting simulators to older versions of Xcode.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't be using it to support your old legacy code because you'd have to be using the latest version of. And you're right. You pretty much have one. Like on the Mac, you can have multiple versions of Xcode. This is going to be a version of Xcode. And it's going to be whatever version you've last updated to, right? So
you're not going to be able to poke around in the file system the way you can on Mac OS,
or have two copies of Xcode. Because currently, because it's a Mac, we can kind of take it apart with our admin access, whereas you're not going to have that kind of access on an iPad, right? That's a good point. Good point. You're not going to dropping down the command line to do stuff, right? Or maybe you will. I don't know. Who knows? I would assume that the files that you're going to work on are going to be stored within the files folder, and then you should be able to, from there, get them onto your Mac and bring them into the real Xcode, kind of thing. I think it's Xcode for the nomad, the guy who wants to, go to the coffee shop and over lunch and, build the UI. Maybe it's for building watch apps. Who knows? Yeah. Well, it'll be exciting to see if it happens. So, I mean, like I said, we've all been chomping at the bit for this particular piece to come. I mean, I'm able to do a lot more these days on my iPad than I hadn't been able to. So in the past, every year it gets a little bit, or every month it gets a little bit cooler to use an iPad, which is cool.
It could definitely just be a sort of a super playground with some more features, more Xcode-ish features, and it would be called Xcode on the iPad, but it would definitely be a much reduced experience from what we're used to. I could see that for the first version.
Well, I did, like, using Photoshop as the analogy, and I did actually, when I first got it, I did pull some files, some Photoshop files, layered documents that I had created on my Mac. I put them on the iPad and I opened them up and just to see if, in fact, the majority of the interface was still there, and layers worked the way layers work and channels worked the way channels worked, and pretty much it was pretty much one-to-one. I mean, I could work on the file, I could make changes on the iPad, then I could send it back over to the Mac and finish up. So, like I said, it could be like if you're going camping for the weekend, you could go take your iPad with you and do a little bit of Xcode while you're sitting around the campfire, and then when you get back to the office or your home office after the weekend's over, you could shove it onto the real Xcode and finish it off and whatever, right? So it'd be interesting to, are we going to be able to ship apps from the iPad, right? That's another interesting one too. Like the iPad is more, it's a bit frustrating sometimes, but every time I go into the browser on the iPad, I'm now able to do things that on the iPadOS that I was not able to do like a year or two ago because it would recognize it as a mobile browser. Now they've got Safari set up so that you can actually, Safari on the iPad can fool a website into the fact that it's a desktop app, right? So a lot of times I'll get a desktop experience on my browsers when in fact I want the mobile experience, right? So I can log into sites that I would not have been able to log into on a mobile device in the past, right? It's kind of they're blurring the lines, as it were. Anyway, so last week I was talking about what I refer to as road apples, which are the products that Apple's made over time that sounded really kind of cool. The early adopters ran out and bought them. I own a couple of them. and they've turned out to be less than favorable over time. People look down upon them now. So I did manage to find several sites that listed, this category of flops that Apple has come up with. This one I've got linked to here in the show notes is the 12 biggest flops of all time, which is arguable. There's a majority, I'd say about 8 of these is on just about every list, so we can just go through them really quickly. But so right off the top, 20th anniversary Mac, which was introduced at the 20th anniversary was sort of a fancy system. It came with a Harman Kardon subwoofer and a black keyboard, but it had a trackpad on the keyboard, and it was would be hand delivered to you. I want to think the price was around $10,000. It was like a lot. It says 7,500 here. It wasn't a cheap system, but as far as Macs go, it was underwhelming at the time compared to the other Macs, like the portable Macs and things that you could have around the same time. So it was a novelty, but I don't think it ever really had a day. Another one that's listed here is the Macintosh TV. I don't know if you guys remember this. It had a TV tuner built into it. It was based on the LC model, where you got the Trinitron screen built into cathode ray tube built into an LC type computer. Black mouse, black keyboard. From a collector point of view, that was kind of it was the first black Mac that you could get. But yeah, it didn't last very long, and it was based on the LC 520. It says here, but yeah, it was kind of boring. It didn't really sell very well. I don't know if you guys remember Pippin. Do you remember Pippin?
Yeah, sure.
The Pippin was Apple's entry into gaming. I think around the time, I think PlayStation had been maybe in its first generation. You had Sega's, you had Genesis, and you had I can't remember if Microsoft had a system at that point in time, but this was Apple's. They joined up with somebody else to come up with this thing. I don't know if it ever even made it out of. I think it was in Japan, right? It says Japan's Bandai partnered with Apple to build this thing, but I don't know if it ever really. No, it's 12,000 units were sold in the US. So interesting. That kind of came and went. Mark mentioned last week. The reason I put this particular list on, I picked it out because this was one of the ones that listed Ping, which we talked about last week, and this was sort of built into iTunes, and it was sort of trying to be your musical Facebook. You could musicians could create accounts in here, and you could join up and you could follow them, and that kind of stuff. I used it for a bit and forgot about it after about a week. I think most people forgot about it after a week too, right? This is one I have trouble with. Newton, they're saying the Newton always had a bad reputation because we're talking about a device that was made in 93. Yeah, it's 93. So back in the 90s, they had handwriting recognition. It was one of the first devices to start the personal digital assistant kind of thing. You had your contacts, you had to-do lists, you had some of them had modems. It had a rudimentary email back then. Yeah, and it was just a cool device. Sorry, go ahead.
It says here 50,000 units though.
From a product point of view, from a sales point of view, it was a failure.
Yeah, I don't know. And we also know that just Steve Jobs, when he came back to Apple, promptly killed it because it was part of the John Scully kind of era in terms of products, right? They had the Performa listed here. Performa was sort of a low-end consumer level product. I don't know. It's sort of it was the next step up from the LCs, so low-cost Macs. So it was kind of a cheaper version of computer, which is fine. I mean, you weren't really doing heavy lifting with it. So this is the one I have trouble with. I actually own a Power Mac G4 Cube. I think it just looks cool. It was a G4 computer at the time when the high-end desktops were all G4 processors. It was made to be. It has no fan, so it's quiet. It had an LCD monitor that came with it. There are two sizes, 15 and 17 inch. I think I have both of them in the garage. And it was just cool. The problem with it was it had an acrylic base, and there's a lot of cracking in the acrylic base. And it had limited expandability. I think that was part of the reason why people considered it a flop, right? So
and it was expensive.
Yeah, for what you got. Yeah.
Was that the one? I do remember it having a cool look, but I also thought it was the one that was plagued with overheating problems.
Yeah, well, I don't know about overheating, but it had that convection thing. Like it stood up on this. I think the heating helped with the cracking of the acrylic, but I mean it sits up. It had a proprietary connector for the video, which was problematic. It was all right. I mean it's nice. Apple III. Now the Apple III was doomed doomed from the get-go, because I think Apple was still segmented. What's the word I'm looking for? Bifurcated. They had two sort of pursuits. The Apple I and Apple II computer were sort of the mainstay throughout the 70s and early 80s in terms of where computing was in general. Apple was leading the market for a long time. The Apple III came out, I think, after the Macintosh, well after the Lisa, and I don't know that it was really released in 1980. It says here, so before the Mac. I don't think it really took off. It was I don't even know if I've never even seen one in real life. Have you guys?
I've seen one. Yeah. Yep.
The PowerBook 5300. I think it was called Jedi when it was being delivered. It got clips. It was the last of the G2, I guess we can call it, processors, because the G3 laptops came out shortly thereafter. It had some weird things, like the memory was on a sort of strange kind of card, and they were difficult to upgrade. Don't know that they lasted very long. The Lisa, of course, which eventually became the what do they call it, Mac XL at the end of its life. It was meant to be an office computer. It was sold for $2,500 or something like that. It sold for $10,000, but it was just about $25,000 today, right? So Lisa has its place in history. It was one of the first GUI computers outside of Xerox, right? So, know anybody who's got one of those, Mark?
Lisa?
Yeah.
I don't know anyone who ever actually owned one, but I remember when they came out very, very clearly, and really, really wanted one.
Did you? Yeah.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the problem with Lisa, I think the software wasn't quite there. It got replaced by the Mac pretty quickly.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
When it came out. And then our friend, the HomePod, is listed on this particular site here as 12 of 13. So does this deserve to be on the list? We talked about this last week, right?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, from a sales point of view, I guess so. Yeah. It's a weird product, as we spent a lot of time talking about it last time. It's a weird product, and it's just kind of hanging out there. So I don't know. I
sort of felt the same way about the iPod when it first came out too. Like, it was sort of an odd thing. And then Apple TV. We didn't talk about the first generation of Apple TV. That kind of sat out there on the shelf for a long, long time. Back when I was a reseller, you had to sell iPods and Macs to be able to sell the Apple TV, and yet it didn't really go anywhere. And it wasn't until Steve Jobs kind of came back around to it a few years later, like 3 or 4 years later, that it had a resurgence and where it is today, right? So I think we've talked about this. The first kick at the cat. Is the world really ready for I mean, I guess it's competing with the Alexa and the Google Home, right? In terms of trying to find a place in the world.
Yeah.
Except that it's different. That's the thing. It's not the same thing, but it's been put into the same space
bucket. Yeah. I mean, we use ours every day. I mean, Carol has one upstairs that she uses in her studio, and we have the one downstairs in the kitchen, and we both interact with it every day. So, and I do find, I've got Alexa and I've got Google Home, or Echo, I should say, and Google Home, and I just find this better. The only difference is with Amazon, I can say, hey, what's the status of my deliveries, I
mean, I forget if we talked about this last time, but just supporting Spotify and stuff like that would have gone a huge way to making it more popular.
Does it? Yeah. So, I mean, we use iTunes Radio on it, right? So we listen to the regular radio on it, but I'm surprised it doesn't have Spotify, to be honest with you. It's just an app, right?
If it had Spotify and maybe even like Sirius XM, you could listen to Howard Stern on Sirius, then it might have actually been something. Yeah.
One thing I like to do, though, is transfer my audio from my phone to it all the time, right? Like if I'm listening to a podcast or a video or whatever, I'll just just hold the phone over top of the HomePod, and the audio just jumps over without even question, right? So, and then of course, the last thing on this list is the iPod Hi-Fi, which was basically a boombox. You plugged your 32-pin connector iPod with a click wheel on it to play your music, right? Made for iPod.
Yeah.
That was an odd one too.
Which also started at $349. So releasing stereo-like items at $349 apparently is not the path to victory.
Right. Yeah, that's the road apples, as it were. There are a few others that I could talk about that are on here, like the Macintosh VS or VC or something like that. That was a pretty. VX was one. I think it was on the market for 8 months before they pulled it and replaced it with another one, which basically made people furious. That was a big one. And some of the LC models were pretty bad. So yeah, there was after the LC 520 that that we talked about just a little while ago, which became the Macintosh DV. I think it was called Performa and also LC, and it was sort of an all-in-one built-in thing. And we used to have one in our family, and it was just problematic. It didn't work at all.
Was that a Power Mac, or was that you're talking about the Performer, right? Was that a Power Mac, or was that a 68,000?
I think it was 68,000. Yeah. Hard to say. Yeah, I think they were 68,000 because the 6100 was the first sort of low-end.
Power Mac. Yeah, I had the 7100, and it was kind of I hate to say it, but it was kind of a crappy machine.
I like the 7100. We had a lot of we used to use those in production, and the 7100s were pretty rock solid because there was a Quadra 650, which was the same body style as the 7100. The
Quadras, as I recall, were good, but they were 68,000, 68040.
Yeah. So then with the and that company Newer came out with these G3 cards you could pop into them to give them more life. The early Power Macs, right? So I still have a 6100 here on the shelf.
That's right. There was a time when you could swap out your processor.
Yeah,
and extend the life of your computer a couple of years.
Yeah. And then it was I think it was around that time when the clones came along, because there was a while the clones were kicking Apple's butt for a while.
The clones were before that. The clones were actually, I believe, were before the Power Macs, weren't they? Or maybe contemporary with the Power Macs.
Contemporary, because I think we had that. There's a couple of companies that made them. Daystar made one. Power Computing made one.
Yep.
I think Bob Levitas was the spokesperson for that. That was pretty dark times. That was the Gil Amelio days, right? And I think that's when Jobs came back. He killed that program right away because he felt that Apple should never have farmed out their hardware. Right?
Yep.
And it turns out he was right. So that's our story about the Road Apples. So I don't know if you guys read this today, but there's an article here by Jim Dalrymple on The Loop. He has got his hands on the Magic Keyboard for the new iPad, and he does not like it. Have you guys read this at all?
Well, did you read further down, though?
Oh, what does he say there further down? I gave up after like a bit. What does he say at the end?
He actually ends up loving it by the end.
Oh, really?
Yeah. This is it's Gruber, right? It's not Dalrymple.
Oh, this is Gruber?
The one that you have linked in there.
Oh, yes, you're right, John Gruber.
Yeah, he does start off by saying that his first impression was really bad. He didn't like it at first, and then he kind of got used to it and kind of figured out how it actually works. And his main point is that it's
so he was holding it wrong, right?
Kind of, yeah. It doesn't have the same feel as, say, a MacBook Air, even though it kind of looks like it, because the iPad is way heavier than the display on a Mac Air. So the hinge has to be stiffer and tighter, and you just have to get used to that. It's a different animal, but once he did, he decided he loves it by the end.
Really?
Yep.
Huh.
Yep.
Well, I guess I kind of got the impression he hated it.
Yeah. You got to keep reading.
Did you read it, Jaime?
Yeah, it definitely does follow sort of the, but there's a twist midway through, right, where he starts going into more, I think once he starts going into more details on how some of the things work, like the hinges and stuff, it starts to make more sense. And the thing I think he gets at is like, it shouldn't surprise you that certain things are the way they are. Like it is, the base, right, of the keyboard is kind of heavier because it has to be, right? Like where else are you going to be able to have something that can be top heavy and yet disconnect really easily and not fall over like a piece of plastic? So there's been people who are like, oh my gosh, like when you have this thing with the, if you have the total weight of the iPad Pro and the Magic Keyboard, it's like, oh, it's heavier than a MacBook Air. And what's the point at that point? It's like, well, because it's not really a MacBook Air, right? Like you're adding capability to the iPad, and yes, there is some compromise, but you end up with something that meets an altogether different sort of use case. And I think that's sort of where he starts out the article of like, oh, he expected it to be, so it's physically similar to a MacBook Air. It'll be like a MacBook Air. And if you come into it with that sort of mindset, you're probably going to be disappointed until you sit with it and say, oh, wait, no, actually, it's a different style of usage. I think very similar to our discussion about Xcode and Photoshop on the iPad versus the MacBook.
Well, he buried the lead in this one because he basically ranted about it for the first, 3/4 of the article.
Totally. Yeah.
So, I mean, I was getting the impression that he was like saying that the magnets were so strong or hard to work with. I can tell you, like I've got the keyboard, this Logitech keyboard combination with my laptop is very heavy, right? And it's very stiff. You can't adjust the screen at all, right? So every time I go to grab it and move the screen, I'm reminded, oh yeah, it's an iPad. It's like a triangle, and it's a solid triangle. I don't get to adjust it or whatever. Whereas I think this new Magic Keyboard style or Smart Keyboard, is that what are we calling it? Smart Keyboard, Magic Keyboard, would be much more flexible in terms of being able to move it a little bit anyway. But I got the impression he was. I mean, in terms of being able to disconnect as well. I mean, like my current iPad Pro is locked into the Logitech keyboard. It takes quite a bit of effort to separate them. So even if Apple had put strong magnets in, the fact that you could separate it with a relatively ease compared to what it's a several hand job to try and get my iPad released from the Logitech currently, right? Yeah, I think it'd be if I had the druthers to run out and buy one right now, I probably would. And it's $350, right? It's only $300 or something like that. Only listen to me
at that magic $349 price we just talked about, the cursed price, right? I think it really depends on what you're looking to do. It's not from my use case, but from listening to other folks, on videos and podcasts and stuff. I'm like, yeah, I could be convinced that if you were a different kind of user than I am, absolutely, it seems like it 100% makes sense, especially because it should be a whole lot easier to manage than even the relatively easy to manage MacBook Pros and stuff. And the thing that is kind of interesting is, because folks have pointed out like, oh, well, Apple tends to have an advantage when it comes to peripherals like this because they know the new device. And I'm not the first one to point this out, but people say, wait a minute, but this is compatible with last year's iPad Pro. So what is the excuse for nobody else coming up with anything even vaguely like this? I mean, that's a testament to the kind of engineering that they put into it.
Right, yeah. Oh, so you can use it with the last year's model?
Yeah, I mean, it is generally true that Apple tends to have an advantage for peripherals of this sort because they know what's coming out and they can make the new device and the peripheral work together seamlessly. But in this case,
right.
You could take last year's iPad Pro and it would work. So people have clearly had some time to come up with it. And I think kudos to Apple for coming up with something that even if there are some compromises over what you might imagine perfection to be, it's pretty darn good.
Cool.
If we weren't in a pandemic world, I would have run out to an Apple store to at least go try it, right, and see how the tactile feel works.
Yeah, that's the thing is the fact that we can't run out and just I'd probably be the same way. I'd probably like walk in, try it out, and go, yep, okay, I'll have one of these. That happened when I wasn't going to go in and buy a 12-inch iPad Pro, but as soon as I saw one, I fell in love with it, right? So I bought it on day one just by visiting the Apple store. Now, if I had sat at home and hemmed and hawed about it, I probably never would have bought one. So that's cool. Speaking of new stuff that just came out, so and in case you're wondering, I'm assuming that nobody on this panel is going to buy an iPhone SE. Although, if you watch Rene posted here today's video from Rene Ritche, which he talks about the iPhone SE 2, second generation. It's a deep dive, 20 minutes long. He covers off a lot of things about this particular phone and compares it to the current phones that are out there, including the Google phones, and takes pictures and videos, talks about the screens, the fact the LCD versus OLEDs, and keeps coming back to the price. I mean, the fact of the matter is this is a high-performing phone, with the A13 chip, competes with the current or the last year's models of iPhone 11 and 11 Pro, and the 10s. It's quite a significant thing. I mean, he even goes into some of the talks that we were just talking about, MP3, which will probably be in the after show, or music sampling, but talks about some of the trade-offs in terms of image quality and that kind of stuff. But Apple's done quite a bit of they do their typical tuning with the LCDs or LEDs, LED or LCD, they tweak the hardware to make it more than acceptable. The average person who's looking for an inexpensive phone is going to have a phone that's going to kick ass for quite a long time, right? So if you really want to take a look at what the differences are between this phone and the current crop of phones that we've been talking about for the last year or 6 months, I guess. Check out this video by Rene Ritche.
I think to your point, I'm not going to buy this as a replacement for my iPhone 10, but I would say that it seems like a really good buy for test devices, right? If you're looking to have dedicated devices, if you're working at a place that's like, oh, we need devices to do stuff. It's like, well, we should test out this brand newer one that will be pretty screaming fast for at least a few years, so you're not stuck with a pokey old hand-me-down now an iPhone at $399. I mean, it's it's not cheap in a compared to many other things in the world, but for the price, everything that you get out of it, it's still pretty good. Like, I don't think there's any shame in having this phone. I just, for myself, happen to be I'm going to buy a higher end phone, and people can shake their fists as to whether that's going to be worth it, and it's probably not from a cost benefit analysis. But I happen to be in a place where I'm happy paying an extra premium for whatever gadget and gimmick that the new iPhones will end up having in the fall.
And I think the average person really doesn't need all the bells and whistles that are in the high end phones these days. I mean, I wouldn't even use most of the fancy camera features and all that if in a brand new phone. Not that I'm going to buy the SE, because I'm going to have to buy the the high end one, but most people don't actually need it, including myself, don't actually need it. So I think at that price point, I can't imagine them not selling a huge amount of these at that price point.
All right. So what's this next story about, Jaime? I saw this tweeted about earlier, but it sounds like it's already sold out, as it were.
Yeah, and I think you had to be invited to it. And what we're talking about is that Apple has apparently invited select developers to attend an accessibility webinar.
What's a select developer, though? I want to know what that is.
Nobody really knows. It's unclear if it was, truly like, whatever you might think of as the elites, or if it was, I don't know, we randomly selected 10,000 developers and said, here, go, the first 500 of you, whoever wakes up and looks at their email and signs up gets it. It's really, really unclear. But, fewer than the entirety of all Apple developers were invited. So some subset. And apparently this, as we are recording, it is the Wednesday prior to Thursday, the 23rd. So by the time this episode goes out, you weren't going to be able to get in anyways, because it sounds like people signed up for it really fast, but it is an online event to learn how you can take advantage of the accessibility features that come in Apple devices, and you'll be able to ask questions during and after the session, and you can sign up for individual consultations. So people are kind of wondering, like, is this a trial run for whatever setup they're going to have, presumably for WWDC 2020, the online-only event, WWDC.
Which is interesting because, even at WWDC, do we have time for questions and answers? I can't remember. Depends on the session, right? Like, usually you huddle around the presenter.
I'm trying to think the last time I saw something like that, but it's a little different. I wonder if they're experimenting here with, presenting content, yet also having sort of like a lab, like a group lab sort of thing where people ask questions.
I think at some of the events they have questions. Like, I remember when Grover was on the stage, they put microphones out in the crowd for people to talk to Grover, right? Sesame Street's Grover.
I don't think it was that one. Was that one of the lunchtime sessions?
This last, it was the final keynote of WWDC this year, the lunchtime session. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
I think it's some of those ones, like the lunchtime ones. They put the microphones out in the aisleways and people line up behind them, right? So at the regular WWDC sessions is what I'm saying. Like they'll say at the end of it, we're going to be down in the lab, so come down and see us. And that's kind of where you go down and ask your questions directly, right? Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Of course, we already support accessibility, so I'm not worried about that. Alrighty. So anyway, I have to go and let my dog out, so I'll be right back. Do you want to start talking about your main topic here, Jaime?
Sure. We've got an article here on view communication patterns in SwiftUI. So this covers, how many different patterns is it? It is 5 different patterns here that we'll talk about and tease about, because I'm actually kind of curious on the panels idea of some of these, because I think I got most of it with limited sort of experience with SwiftUI. A lot of it I was able to map to other sort of patterns and techniques I've used. But one of them was sort of baffling to me, so I think maybe some discussion here. So the 5 different ways are going to be from, getting data from a parent, like a parent view, to a direct child, getting from a parent view to a distant child, or grandchildren, I suppose, going the opposite direction from child to direct parent, from child to distant parent, and between children, right? So siblings, if you want to call it that. So the first one, a parent to direct child, that seems fairly straightforward. I think this is one that folks are going to be pretty familiar with, of like, they have this example hierarchy of a content view with a to-do list view, sort of subordinate to it. So using the initial initializer works out pretty good, right? You've got your individual to-do list items, and you can pass those along from your content view to the to-do list view, and then each one down to a to-do item view, a singular one. So that makes sense, right? Mark, do you agree?
Yep.
Makes sense so far?
Makes sense. Yep.
All right. And then they set up the scenario of parent to distant child. So imagining keep in mind the chain here. And imagine, it's very difficult in an audio-only format, but bear with me. So a scene delegate has something, right? Like an image cache, let's say. You have a content view, then down to a to-do list view, and then a to-do item view. And very finally down to a to-do item details. So the scenario is you've got this singular data cache, and you'd like to get that cached image available for the very, very down at the bottom child, the to-do item detail. So in this case, prior to SwiftUI, people would have used something like, a magic context or God object or environment object. And surprise, surprise, there is a thing called the environment in SwiftUI that you can use to sort of pierce the veil, magically, and now you can get access to stuff. So that one makes sense. It's kind of pretty similar to the singleton pattern that people have used and oftentimes abused, but it is something I think that people get. So that makes sense. The next one is also, I think, fairly understood from child to direct parent, where you use, in this case, bindings and callbacks. So callbacks, I think, is a little bit the most straightforward of like, hey, you've got a view that needs to say, hey, whoever it is that asked me to keep track of these things, this thing was tapped, this was swiped, somebody did a gesture of some sort, this event occurred. And bindings is kind of really a cool way to just, share this channel of communication between, two different things, parent and child in this case. Say, yep, user has selected or edited this to-do item, and now in the list, the parent says, cool, I know that whatever that item was has now been updated. So I think that works out sort of pretty well. I'm going to skip the confusing one because I want to go to the other one that I think was easy. So the other one that seemed pretty straightforward, but I'm really like capturing it all here in this article. It's definitely worth a read. It's got, pretty diagrams. So they talk about the between children, which is siblings, right? So if you had, two different buttons that or two different controls, I should say, that belong to the same content view, what do you do? And they call it lifting the state up, right? So in this case, it's like a button that was initialized by a content view can call back to that content view, and then using the binding that we talked about before, a toggle might react to that thing, right? So that sort of makes sense, like go up to the common ancestor, as opposed to say like using, shove something into the environment and just make everything a global variable. Like that's not necessarily a good pattern. And in this case, it sort of illustrates it's not totally necessary. You lose a little something when you do that. The one that was a little confusing to me, if I'm being quite honest, was the from child to distant parent use preference key. And I feel like I'm going to have to reread this section quite a few times. But having not used preference key, I was kind of confused. I was like, okay, so preference key requires some sort of default value for a preference and a reduce method that combines all child values into a single one visible to their parent. And you get what appears to be a named value produced by a view. And then I blacked out and I couldn't understand the rest at that point. I was like, wait, what? So do either one of you understand what's really going on here? Because I was really confused.
So the problem they're trying to solve is, of course, that in SwiftUI, you can't really pass around references to objects at all. And you can't really have things like delegates because everything's being refreshed all the time, right? So if you just say, because everything is a value type, everything's a struct, just saying child.delegate equals self creates a copy of self. So self is not, the self that you care about is not actually your delegate. So you're calling the delegate on the wrong thing. So you need a way to pipe things up the chain, and so all the way back up the top to the top, right? So the stuff about the reduce thing, I think what's going on there is just that you have a chain of things that all have access to the same preference key, and the one at the bottom, you might set the one at the bottom and it's propagating up, but then a one in the middle might have changed or something like that. So the reduce has to explain how to handle that kind of stuff. So you have to take all of the possible changes or values that have been passed up and decide what to do with them at the very end. And that's what the reduce does, I believe. Although I haven't used it myself, but that's what it feels like to me. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
I think so, but I think I'm going to have to reread this with that in mind, because I was looking at the code, all right, I was like, oh wait, and magic happened here, and I didn't understand how this mapped together. But I think based off of what you said, I sort of get. So having it in mind that you can't pass around references and stuff, and you're trying to bubble things up up into a single pass sort of cycle. I think I get what they're trying to do here.
Right. So say your default value is 1 at your top level, and you have 10 things down, and just sort of by definition, they can all change this thing. So say each one, say at level 2 it changes to 2, level 3 it changes to 3, level 4 changes to 4, level 10 changes to 10. Well, which one do you actually want to use? You have to make that decision somehow, because they can all change it. So the reduce method takes all of these values that you've put in and decides which one you want to use, and you have to define what that process is.
Interesting. They do have, and I probably should have started out the discussion with the example that they were trying to use of a view that has a button that shows an alert, and how you end up getting that to pass things along. So maybe I might have to chew on this outside of the show, given the discussion we just had there. But it's helpful because of all of these, some of these were pretty good refreshers. Somebody's like, oh, okay, so that's the SwiftUI equivalent. And this is the one that had me sort of scratching my head and wondering what was going on.
Okay. Next you have up.
Next is the remote work report by GitLab. The future of work is remote. And it's kind of lengthy. So, of course, we'll have this in the show notes for those of you driving at home. It's kind of interesting to read. There are, as always, the normal caveats with this sort of thing. Of how representative is this? And they say here that their sample size was 3,000 professionals aged 21 or older who work remotely or have the option to work remotely, are in roles with digital output between January 30th to February 10th, 2020.
So not the real world anymore.
It's interesting timing for that, right? Because now, and it's a big reason why I wanted to talk about it, is like now everybody who can work remotely is pretty much doing that. It's very different. Yeah. As some folks point out, quarantine work is not the same as remote work. It is different when you have a prepared organization who's ready to deal with remote work, and it's very different when you don't have the existential dread or even just the cabin fever, depending on your situation related to that. But even with all those caveats, some of the takeaways here are kind of interesting, right? So I think folks would not be surprised that hiring remotely is a hiring advantage, right? You have access to a larger talent pool than you would normally have.
Right.
Like who lives here in this zip code, who lives here in this city, who lives here in this state, sort of thing. Even who lives here in this country. Also, the idea that more and more roles are becoming remote friendly. And again, pre-pandemic, we're talking about, right? Like we're non-emergency situation. Like I'm looking at the kinds of departments, and they say here it was like 26% of folks who had responded were in IT, networking, security, and the next big chunk is operations at 12%. And then you get sort of down to the area of like administration and HR, which are relatively low percentages. And when you look at the titles that match up of manager, associate, director, senior manager, senior director, C-level, and other, they tend to be sort of spread out a little bit, which is interesting. I don't know if that's a factor of sort of reality or if that's a factor of the particular people that they surveyed, but it's something to look at, right? So for this particular set of folks, 53% were from the USA, 27% from the United Kingdom, 10% from Canada, and 10% from Australia. So that tells you something a little bit about the kinds of folks that were involved in this. So it skews a certain way, right? So if you look at attitudes on remote working, 90%, I would recommend working remotely to a friend. I'm kind of interested in the counter, right? The 10% who would not want to work remotely, or at least would not recommend it to friends. Very curious in that perspective. I say that as somebody who's been working remotely for 3, coming up on 4 years remotely, and not gonna lie, it was an adjustment, but I'm loving it. It's great having a 10-foot commute, from the bedroom over to the home office, if we can call it that.
Would you go back to working in an office?
Boy, I could, I could, but it would really require some changes to my lifestyle. Like I think I would have to live somewhere else. Like I'm out in the suburbs. I'd probably want to live closer to where most of the offices for tech tend to be, the South Lake Union or downtown-ish areas, Pioneer Square areas of Seattle, so that I wouldn't have like a soul-crushing car commute, because we don't really have great transit out here. I can't just jump on a subway train to be in there in any reasonable amount of time. And I also think beyond the sort of lifestyle changes, thing that goes along with that is I would need some combination, not necessarily probably both of these, even though that's ideal, but certainly one or the other very heavily weighted. So I'd have to be very passionate about, what it is I'm working on, and or I'd have to get, truckloads of cash for it to do it.
Right, yeah.
Right,
yeah,
and I could see myself making the adjustment. But, if somebody came to me like, hey, here's something that's very similar to what you're doing now, and it pays $5,000 more than you make now, I'd be like, no, you're not dislodging me from my home office for $5,000. $50,000, maybe I might think about it, right? Or if it's like, hey, you get to go set up the the equivalent of Amazon Web Services, but for this totally new company. It's like, oh, okay, sure. You want me to be VP of something or other? You could convince me to go back into the office for that. Yeah. So I think that gets into some of the benefits of working remote that folks are talking about. Flexible scheduling, which is certainly something I appreciate. Lack of commute, I mentioned. Cost savings is iffy. I haven't really sat down and figured it out. Now, I've been fortunate to work at places that are at Simple prior and at the Banno team, Jack Henry now, that are pretty good about providing the equipment you need. But I didn't really sort of push it for I have absolutely nothing, set me up with everything, right? I was very particular. I already had my desk that I liked, so I didn't ask them for a desk. I didn't ask them for, actually I did get monitors in both cases, and, furnished laptops and stuff and webcams, but I didn't really sit and think like, should I have gotten a full ergonomic layout, right? For footrests and an ergonomic chair and all these other things that maybe I could have, right? So is it really a savings when I buy myself my own chair and other things? I don't know. I'd have to calculate it out. So I'm very curious on the cost savings. I mean, clearly I'm saving on wear and tear on my vehicle and gasoline. And
transportation for sure. You're saving on meals. You're saving, you're saving on clothing. You don't have to buy pants, right?
Well, maybe saving on meals, right? Because certainly it is cheaper to eat, soup and sandwich at home than it was to go out and buy something. But there are many companies, tech companies, who do have free meals.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Improved ability to do other things like take care of family or pets and stuff. Like my dog, gets into trouble sometimes. Oh, okay. Well, it's less of a hassle to say, hey, I'm going to be out in the afternoon. I need to take him to the vet, and it's totally fine, right? Because I have the flexibility of like, if I really truly needed to get something done, I could, do it from home, or if not, it's like, whatever. I'll just take care of it tomorrow. It's not like, oh, okay, well, man, with traffic, there's no way I can even get home, so we have to take him tomorrow, and like it just reduces a ton of stress. And I feel like that's a big key beyond the sort of nicety of flexibility is just the reduced amount of stress from, oh man, like I woke up late and now I'm going to be stuck in traffic, or I'm going to miss the meeting. It's like I have to wake up so late that I completely miss meetings. It's like the only way for me to miss meetings now, right? It's not like, oh man, I missed the last train. I didn't get in the car broke down. It's the main thing I have to worry about, or main two things are internet is down or power is out. And at that point, it's like, well, people got to understand that, it takes heroic effort to overcome those.
Right. Yeah. Those are not trivial. But I kind of wonder, the fact that we've all had to do this protect in place or shelter in place thing, working from home for the last little while, I think it's going to change a lot of companies' perception of the capability. It's funny, we were just talking in one of our meetings today about, we had a retro at the end of our sprint, and we were talking about, the challenges of being at home and dealing with the stress of what we're all going through right now. And it's interesting because some people were saying that they don't have a proper desk environment. They don't have they're not able to, they're living in a family with people, and, they're sitting at the dining room table or sitting in their bedroom on their bed because they don't have a desk, It's different when I ran my own business from my house for 10 years or so. And that was, so the majority of the time I was in at home, and, if I had to go out to a client or whatever, I could do that and plan that. But like you said, I could kind of I could putter my way there and I could putter my way home kind of thing. I didn't have to, it wasn't on a set schedule. The difference is now that when I do go into the office, I don't necessarily see all the people all the time, but, it does give you that sort of mental separation from work at home kind of thing, to physically go somewhere. But I lose lose I have a short commute, but still I lose an hour or so a day to commuting, right? Which is my podcast time, for listening to podcasts and audiobooks and stuff like that. But and there's also that expense, right? So I to be honest with you, I think based on the kind of work that we do, I still say a lot of it. I think the majority of it can be done through remote, right? I know of entire companies like your, I don't know if yours is completely remote, but companies like WordPress are completely remote. It's a remote team, and they're international. I mean, there are people in UK and United States and stuff like that working across the globe that work for that company, right? In all the different levels of work that they do, right? So it's different when you have something like a retail environment. Like our company also supports retail, so we have a large contingent of workers who don't have that as an option, right, to work from home. And if you're like in manufacturing or prep, food prep or whatever, hotel, restaurant kind of stuff, or healthcare, you have to be on site to do your work, right? But I think that this is going to be a real education for companies to sort of see and reevaluate whether or not they need to have that expensive office for people to go into, right? So, and if they could do like your company and the last two companies you've worked for or have all been remote, right?
Yeah, not remote only, like the folks at Automatic WordPress, but definitely very remote heavy and remote friendly. And
right, yeah.
It does like we were talking about the iPhone SEs as test devices.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a scenario for you that I think companies have to plan for of what happens when you don't have access to a cabinet of test devices at an office. What happens when an iOS engineer needs to test Face ID and doesn't have a Face ID device, or likewise a Touch ID device. These are the sorts of things that I think we need to sort of consider of like either doing without, in terms of we do our best, and if there's bugs, we'll fix them blindly, is not necessarily a great option, but I think it is an option. Or two, reevaluate, maybe there are, maybe it's not that expensive to have, company owned and managed devices that you could ship out to your engineers. I think it really depends on, in my opinion, like how serious you are about supporting those different features, right? Like it's very easy to say, oh, well, we need to support this device. Cool. Can we get one? Oh no, the budget doesn't have room for that. It's like, are you kidding me? How do you not have budget for that? Like it's a $400 device, for heaven's sakes. Do you know how much time we're spending here? Like we've already burned that amount of money just arguing about whether it's worth the time and money to buy the damn device. And so I think it will just, the meta point is I think people will need to reevaluate, what are these costs and what is different. And again, quarantine work is different from remote work. But, once we get past we're all forced into this by circumstance, now, you start planning for the future of, all right, how can we be more effective? What does that really mean?
Let me ask you, when you have your meetings with your teams and stuff like that, are you doing video calls or are you doing just audio calls and somebody sharing a screen, or how you do that? Yeah,
I guess that gets at culture, because our team, this is the Bano team at Jack Henry, is very video, very much a video conferencing culture.
As is ours.
So, right. Which can cause some confusion and oddities with other parts of the company that are audio only. Like one of our sibling divisions is like, oh, you guys are video. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and turn on video too. But just so you know, we're used to audio only. So I think you have to be sort of forthcoming about those. Not to say one is right and one is wrong, but just, understand how you're going to work together, right? Because, clearly when you go into a physical office, this doesn't come up, right? It's not like everybody's behind some sort of, duck blind or something, right? Like you can actually see, they're not like, when 2020 or Dateline interviews somebody and they're like in the shadows and their voices all changed. Like you get, information about people and how they're feeling and everything, just as a natural consequence of that. It's not feasible to make, and it's kind of silly to reduce those things. But I think since we have the option here, it's good to think about it. So I personally prefer to have, and this is just my own, not saying it's right, wrong, or indifferent, just my own preference. I like having the video turned on in general, because it helps me get a better sense of, is what I'm saying to people.
Is anyone paying attention to what I'm saying, or are they just all,
right.
Or are they all surfing the net, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they do that in meetings too, by the way. Like in physical meetings, you see people looking down at their lap in the middle of a meeting, right? But I find that, to be honest with you, I'm the same way. We generally don't do video. We'll have a screen share, and somebody will be sharing their desktop kind of thing. But I do find it's very difficult to follow along sometimes sometimes when it's just people talking, because like you said, you take visual cues from people, you can see their faces, you can see their reactions to things, right? So it is challenging to do, like not like an audio only kind of meeting and sort of have everybody on the same page, right?
Yeah. But I will say that having participated in some audio only meetings, it is an opportunity for me to stretch and pace if I need to. That's something you couldn't normally do in an in-person meeting, right? It'd be kind of weird if everybody was sitting at the conference table and I just get up and start wandering around, right? I'd look like a crazy person. But I could do that in an audio-only meeting. And in an audio-only meeting, I also feel more comfortable eating, right? I'm like, I'm kind of hungry. This meeting's going long. I want lunch. Well, I'll just start eating lunch. As long as I'm muted, nobody can hear.
Right.
So there's pros and cons, and I'll admit it, as silly as it is. Sometimes I'm like, maybe I should do something about the background behind me. Like some of these people have really nice little setups, right? It looks very professional. Here I am with my half-hearted attempt at like getting a usable office. And I think that's, in some respects, some ways that we've seen the popularity of the virtual backgrounds for Zoom and Microsoft Teams and Skype, right? Of like, all right, maybe, I've got 3 kids and there's, laundry tossed all over the place, but looks like I'm in Finding Nemo in the background. Nobody knows the difference, right? So I could still be on video, but without having to put on a bigger show or inconvenience my life in order to have that capability.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you saw, there's a tweet this week of, all the kids are doing online schooling now, right? Because of the COVID and stuff like that. And so there was a lady said she found her kid playing with her dog rather than sitting in class. And she showed her parent that she had taken a picture of herself paying attention and pasted it into the video chat, like there's the still image. And that she says that they don't know, the teachers can't tell that you're not paying attention. And she's 10.
Right. Because in a class of 15 to 30, there's no way the teacher is looking that closely at them, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. I have not done that technique, but I have done the trolling technique where, here's the pro tip on, I know this works on Zoom at the very least. If you make your avatar, a picture of yourself, as if you were on the video. And I did the little like Steve Jobs, pose, like I'm thinking about something. And then I would turn on my video with me in that pose. So it looks seamless if you're kind of not paying attention, right? Just to see how long it would take people, how many different meetings they say before they say, wait a minute, weren't you wearing like a white t-shirt? Why do you have a red t-shirt now?
Oh, you don't even like do the proper continuity. That's crazy.
No, like purposely, right? Of just like, let me make something that's very basic and it would not work if I started with something flamboyant. It was,
of course.
Just, a plain basic, neutral color shirt. And then, you can wear the neutral color shirt. And then the next day you can change the tone. Like I would even want to see if somebody, went through all of the gradients of color before somebody said, wait a minute, wasn't that shirt like just kind of blue, not deep blue?
Yeah, crazy.
Yeah. As we're on day 867 of the lockdown, this is what we do now. This is our life.
This is fun. This is quarantunes. Or what do they call it? What did I hear today? COVIDiot. Yeah. All right. Let's move on to our picks since we've got a real long show so far. So I'll let you go off because I've got 3 of them here. So do your pick for me.
Yeah, mine is JetBrains Academy. So this is put together by the JetBrains company. You might know them from the IntelliJ IDE or AppCode, PyCharm. And apparently they're working with, what does it say here?
They also do Android Studio, right?
Also do Android Studio. That's right. They're working with hyperskill.org on these learning to program by creating working applications tracks. And right now they have 3 tracks available for Java, Kotlin, and Python. So if you're looking to do something new and different, I'm kind of eyeing the Python and Kotlin ones myself.
Yeah, Kotlin sounds interesting.
They look pretty nifty. And I think like this Kotlin one is 25 hours of content. The Python is 34. And how much is the Java? Whoa, the Java is 82.
And these are free?
Free, but I do believe it is limited time in some way. So is JetBrains Academy now under an early access program? It is currently in the early stages of development. While in early access, the use of JetBrains Academy's tools is free of charge. And of course, you explicitly acknowledge that you may encounter errors and other things. You're basically getting like beta type access. But it's free, at least for the time being. No warranty express or implied on this. But while we're all sort of stuck, and unless you're watching the new Trolls World Tour movie that is available, or the Scooby-Doo 3D animated one, once you run out of time to do other stuff, why not check this out and try a different language, see how the other side lives.
Yeah, cool. Again, I've got a couple of picks here. The first one is COVID related. This is called Health Storylines, and this app came out fairly recently. What it is it's a tool for tracking your journaling your daily experiences, how you're feeling. The idea behind this is they're trying to capture information about how people are becoming infected and getting infected and developing through, God forbid you get COVID-19. So it's sort of a step up from where we were looking at last week, a couple of apps, the one from Apple and the one from the Government of Canada. This one just keeps track of your daily moods, your daily feelings, how you're dealing with the stress, if you're having any symptoms, and it's sort of crowdsourcing the data from people. You can be anonymous or you can be forthright with it. And the idea is to sort of get a sense of how this is spreading throughout the world. So I've been using it for last week to sort of keep track of things, just to see what's what. You can, of course, do a quick check yourself. Again, it's another one of these apps that's got the quick check to see if you have multiple symptoms, and of course they'll direct you to a healthcare professional should you have more than the requisite number of symptoms. But health storylines. I think it's available on Android too, but this is just for iOS, and I'm not sure if it's only Canada, so I don't know if you guys want to click on the link and see if it shows up for you. Hey, guess what? We were talking about Photoshop earlier on the iPad. This is another story from the fine folks over at Adobe. If you do have a Photoshop only subscription or any of the Creative Cloud things, Fresco is an app that we talked about on the show before. It came out for iPad. It's an illustration app. It does watercolor, does oil paint. You can have custom brushes in it. There's all kinds of media online about it. We introduced the evangelist for this, Kyle. I've forgotten his last name now. Anyway, on Roundabout, we interviewed him. He talked about his brushes and that kind of stuff and how he got hired on as Adobe as their evangelist. So this is Adobe Fresco Premium is now included in your $10 a month Photoshop for iPad subscription. So if you already have that, I have the photography bundle, which gives me Photoshop itself on my Mac, as well as Lightroom, and also gives me access to Photoshop on the iPad. And I just got a message here when I opened up Photoshop a little while earlier saying that I had access to Fresco. I do have a copy of Fresco on my on my iPad right now. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, take a look at that. It seems to be free or included in your Photoshop subscription if you have one already. And my last pick is sort of a self-promotional one, I guess, if you will. Not really self-promotional, but I took my app that I try to keep up to date with the latest things. Device Tracker. It's my Pizza Money app, and I decided this weekend that I would try and take a shot at dark mode. I think we opened it last week, and we were looking at it on the iPad with the new trackpad support and mouse support, and some of the features that were working for me right out of the box. So I thought, well, let's take a look at dark mode. There was a few things I didn't like about the app once I opened it in dark mode. I wanted to change some of the icons around and some of the background colors. It was pretty simple to go in and create the features I needed to do. I just had to, in one case, there's like a default icon that appears when you create a new record. I wanted to have a dark mode version of that, so I just went into Interface Builder, turned on Any and Dark, and uploaded a dark mode version of that. The colors in the app are basically, I have 3 colors in my logo, which I call IT Guy Blue. So I have a dark, a medium, and a light color, and I was able to, those were defined, as UI colors in the code, a certain percentage of red, green, and blue divided by 255. So I was able to go into the asset library and create a new color set for those three. So I labeled them the same as the color sets now, and I just put in the RGB values and created those three colors, and then it was able to use those colors to call them out by UI color with name to call them out and use them throughout the app, and that was fairly straightforward as well. So and the last thing I tested last night was I decided, well, since I'm putting up on TestFlight, let me see if I can create a public link for people to sign up. So I posted a public link on my Twitter account for people to test drive it for me. The app's not perfect, but it was an exercise to go through and see how much work was involved in dark mode. Oh, and one more thing, I had to get rid of all my UI web views because as of 2 days ago, I think Apple is, or the 30th, I think Apple's not accepting apps, even upgraded apps that have UI web view in them. So I took a few minutes to go back and remove my UI web views and replace them with WebKit, WK web views, and that was again pretty painless. It's come a long way since it came out 3-4 years ago. It was there was very little you could do with WebKit. You had to do a lot of the lifting yourself, but now it's much more seamless. It's just a matter of importing WebKit and then changing your URL request to say, instead of load web view, you just say load, and then you pass in the web view. That was pretty simple. So yeah, dark mode, TestFlight, public beta, and some code cleanup, and get rid of the WK, or get rid of the UI web views, and that's my device tracker, which is going to push out to it's in TestFlight right now. I'll get it on the App Store probably in a few more days. And by the way, now that we're in the COVID cycle, it did take a little bit. Like when you push out your TestFlight app to have external testers, it has to be reviewed. That normally took me like maybe an hour or two in the past. It took almost a full day to get that through app review. So obviously they're all working from home as well at Apple, so it takes a while to get things through the queue. But it was not as long as it could have been. But yeah, so I'm actually got the public beta turned around in, I guess, half a day, let's say, from when I pushed up TestFlight and made the request. So that's my last pick, is device tracker for the iPad and the iPhone. And soon as I implement photos into it, I'll be able to put it on the Mac using Catalyst. Anyway, so that's it for another week. So hey, Jaime, if people want to get in touch with you, how will they do that?
I'm on Twitter as @DevWithTheHair.
All right, Mark, if people want to get in touch with you?
At markr@smapsoft.com.
All right, once again, my name is Tim Mitra, Timmitra. On the Twitter machine is where you'll find me. And so until next time, we'll say bye.
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 This has been another episode of the More Than Just Code podcast. This is Mike Van Ogmans, MTJC's favorite voiceover artist for some reason. If you want to find out more about the show, you can visit the More Than Just Code website at mtjc.fm. There you can find a summary and show notes of each episode. We list links to the apps, code, and news that we mentioned on the show. If you like the podcast, tell your friends. Please leave a comment on the website, and if you can, please write a review on iTunes. And please recommend us in your favorite podcatcher. All of these things help others find out about the show. We really appreciate your help with spreading the word. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you, so use the hashtag AskMTJC. Once again, the podcast Twitter account is @MTJC_podcast. Please consider supporting the show by pledging any amount on patreon.com/MTJC. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.
Unseen. There we go. Another one in the can.
Tim, are you going to add the pointer manipulation stuff for iPad on device tracker?
Pointer manipulation?
I forget what this...
Oh, yeah.
The new pointer related stuff.
Yeah, I don't really have to. Oh, you mean like changing from iBeam to I should check that out. I think I'm getting that already for free.
Yeah, if you use built-in out-of-the-box UI views, then you do get it for free.
So this app used to be, it started out life as a traditional table view master detail view controller app. In other words, I had no storyboards, no nibs in it, right? It was all done in code. And then 3-4 years ago, I put in I used the split view when the iPhone 6 came out, right? I had the 6 Plus, and I wanted to have that because it had that split view on if you held the phone in landscape. I implemented the storyboard template and basically built myself a storyboard that handles split view controller. So that's when I started using UI, and then so I changed all the buttons that were all programmatic to proper UI kit buttons, and or what do you call them, bar button items, So they're out of the box kind of thing, and then so all of those behave as they should with mouse support, and I also just added a camera button as well because I had a ability to add photos, but I don't know why I didn't have the camera button in there. But I was looking at yesterday on how to implement photos. Photos is quite different than the old UI. Was it UI image picker framework we were using before, where you could have
the photos framework. It's hugely different, but that's been around for like 5 years already.
I hadn't. Yeah. So the only reason I would look at putting it in because all I'm doing is grabbing a photo from your photo library or grabbing a photo from the camera and putting it into the record, right? So I don't really need a lot of heavy lifting, but I noticed that on the Mac when I tried Catalyst out that the handling of photos wasn't quite savvy, right? So when I looked into some of the tutorials, like Ray Winter has a tutorial on implementing Catalyst and a few other things. They have a pro video on how to use photos on the Ray Winter site by Lindsay Taylor, I think is her name. But she kind of goes quite a bit of detail because you have the PH assets. You've played with it, right, Mark?
Yeah, I used it quite a bit.
PH assets and the PH asset collections and stuff like that. Yep. Yeah, so
it's actually quite nice. It was very different when I first switched over to that from the old one, whatever it was called. Yeah. I don't even remember what it was called anymore.
Yeah, it was like a lower level one, right? AV Media, something like that, or AV.
No, there was an old, I forget. Anyway, there was an old one that was kind of equivalent but just older, and it was a pretty big change to change over. But it's pretty nice because it does a lot of stuff asynchronously, so you get placeholder images and you don't have to wait blocked for things to load and things like that. So it's pretty nice.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed that was interesting about the Photos framework, if you will, is that it also handles the iCloud images, right? Like, because they're not on the device; they're actually they're downloadable objects, right? So you can grab this, and also the fact that you can list all your albums. I find it's pretty frustrating when I go into other people's apps and see all the because if I go to pick an album, an image up off of another app, I sometimes find that they give you your albums and then they give you every event as an album. I don't know if you've seen that. Yeah. Super annoying because it takes forever to scroll through those to find the album you're looking for. So
some people like that though, but I don't know.
I think personally I find that just being able to get to the I probably have like 20 or 30 albums already, but I don't need every single time I've picked up my camera as an event, sort of to show up, which is what it does. It clumps them all together. So ultimately, I'd like to make an app that has the ability to edit the metadata in the images, which you can do on the Mac, but you can't seem to do on the iPhone or on iOS, I should say. I don't know if that's even possible.
Yeah, I used to do it when I was working at what was it? Relive, photo sharing company. We did that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Where you could go in and change, like, add keywords and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And descriptions and things.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, because it makes it handy because the search does work. Like if you're looking for a cat or a dog or a bicycle, you generally get pretty good results. You get some real anomalies sometimes in the Photos app. But if you're looking for something specific, like an iMac or an iPad, it doesn't often find those for you easily, right? I mean, I have thousands of pictures of iPads in my photo library, right? Yet I can't use that as a search term, right? So, which I find funny considering Apple made the iPad. But yeah, so it'll be interesting to see. It's going to be I don't know if I'll wait on this particular update to get photos in there, but that's obviously, I think that's something I need to do before I go to Catalyst, for sure.
I forgot the device tracker was the more normalish app, and it was the Pi Day countdown that I've suggested be the boondoggle.
Yeah, the boondoggle app.
Where you add ARKit 3.5 and the new pointer interactions.
Yeah. I was thinking about rewriting it in SwiftUI, actually, just for fun, because it's a bit long in the tooth. Actually, it's funny, I made the Pi Day countdown way back in 2010, I think, right? It was for March 14th, 2010. And every year I go to a party for New Year's Eve, right? And I usually pull out my Pi Day countdown to midnight, right? And for years, I would pull the thing out, and then the entire party would be like totally oblivious to the fact that I had this app, and 3 people in the room would know about it, right? Even last year I pulled it out. Well, this year they actually used Pi Day countdown to count down to midnight. So I find it's taken me 10 years to get them to do it, but finally they got around to doing it. So woohoo!
I mean, a lot of the overnight successes took many years to start, so maybe this is the beginning now.
Yeah. But I'm using some weird sort of font in it, and it doesn't look right when you use regular strings and stuff like that. So it needs work. I think I did update it. I added iAd to it back in the day, and had to take it out and switch over to AdMob, and I don't think I've made a single dollar off of it in terms of ads.
It's a different world for sure, right? It's especially now since advertising is all depressed at the moment as a market for the economy's in a world of hurt, right? So people are pulling back on that.
Yet another upgrade to Zoom to deal with. Now supporting dark mode is very confusing.
Are they? Oh.
Yeah. It's amazing how many apps you see support dark mode and how many that don't. Like Google, oh my god, I'm blinded by Google Docs. I'm surprised they don't support dark mode. I guess it's a Google versus Apple thing, right?
I think it's more of Google's never really cared about UI, particularly. It's true. They never really have. Mm-hmm. So, hey, you know what I've been watching on Netflix is Kim's Convenience.
Oh, yeah.
It's really funny.
It's actually just down the street from me.
There's an actual store?
Yeah. I have a picture of myself standing in front of it. It's down the road from here. Actually, there's a scene in one of this year's episodes where they were standing on the corner. I live on Gerrard. I live on Logan at corner of Gerrard and Logan. Gerrard goes east-west, Logan goes north-south. And there's a scene taken from the cameraman estimates, just how they have the little in-between scenes between, and they show parts of the city. Yeah. So there was a scene that was filmed just from the corner where I literally am all the time catching the streetcar kind of thing, right? Yeah. So, you look at it like, whoa, that's my hood.
So do they ever film the actual show? I mean, not the in-between scenes, but the actual show around there in the real area?
Yeah. I mean, we have a lot of you'll see them at night. They'll have the camera crews with the the big light pots to sort of light the place up, because they actually do sometimes film in that store, coming in, you'll see scenes of him sweeping the sidewalk and stuff like that, and
okay. But the store you see in the show is
that's a set.
That's a set. Okay, yeah.
Actually, just south of me is what we I don't know if we still call it Hollywood North or whatever, but there's a whole bunch of those big barns that they do for films. They look like you could build an airplane in them, a jumbo jet kind of thing. They have a lot of those just south of me, and they do a lot of film work down there, right? Movie. That's where Star Trek and all that kind of stuff is filmed and stuff. Maybe that's what's wrong with Star Trek Discovery. Mark, it's filmed just down the street from my house. But so a lot of that stuff is sets, and I have a lot of friends who work in the in the TV business and whatever. My nephew he works on a lot of shows. He worked on Designated Survivor for a bit and a few other things. Yeah. So, cool.
So I finally finished Discovery.
Oh, yes. Exciting, eh?
Season 2. Yeah.
That's all he's going to say.
Well, the best parts were the ones on Enterprise when none of the Discovery characters were around.
You mean like when they had Number One and Pike and stuff like that? Or
Yeah,
those were good shows, good episodes. Yeah, but even they even played with that. I mean, I guess if they could go back and do a show with Jonathan Archer, they could do a show with Christopher Pike, right? So before the accident, I think they even didn't they at one point sort of have the the reactor blowing up and him having to sacrifice himself in one of those episodes, or was it?
They showed what would happen in the future, how he ends up getting that injury.
Yeah.
But they did build that expensive Enterprise set, and that's why everybody's like, well, obviously they're going to make a Pike one because it was, a well-received character, and they actually spent the money to build the set versus just redressing the Discovery bridge.
True. No, I think they must have actually made a set. It's a completely different shape, right? So, yeah, that's another sort of continuity thing, that the way that the Discovery bridge looked compared to the retro 60s
the
style.
Discovery one was way more modern than the Enterprise one. I had trouble believing that the Enterprise was supposed to be the more advanced ship.
Well, they went back. They got rid of all the skewmorphic stuff and went back to like flat.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that was their iOS 7.
There's people who are getting Nirvana vinyl albums, and that was never a thing, right? Vinyl stopped being a thing long before Nirvana came on the stage.
Are you sure?
I'm sure there was like some vinyl manufacturing plant somewhere, but there certainly wasn't a whole bunch of brand new vinyl records being made with Nevermind.
Yeah. Well, a friend of mine, she was recording when there was, like, she was just starting out when there was vinyl, right? And just at the very end of it, tail end of it, and then about, I guess, 3 years ago, when I first met her, she just came out with a new vinyl album, so she kind of saw both. She sort of bookended both ends of the vinyls going away and vinyls coming back, kind of thing. And she's not that old, so I mean, she was probably about in the same age range as those guys, or maybe a bit younger. So if vinyl was around still then, yeah. But you're right. There is a whole slew of artists who never were on vinyl that are all of a sudden now on vinyl, right?
Yeah. I mean, we see everybody on Zoom.
I've still got a couple of hundred vinyl records at my parents' house back in Massachusetts somewhere. Yeah. I have no idea what condition they're in. And they've probably been just sitting in a closet for years, so they're probably all warped and melted.
Yeah, Jonathan kept all my albums. Like I think we got rid of a bunch of them, but he and a friend of his split them up, and he kept them in his garage for the longest time. Of course, we have all this, weather and snow and whatever, so all the covers are all rippled and stuff. But now he's now got, a record player, and he's bought a bunch of records. He's probably got a couple of hundred records now that he bought through some estate sales and stuff like that, right? So it's all coming around. I have a few mounted albums on my wall in frames, those 12-inch frames. So I got a few. I got a couple of original ones, but yeah. What do you know? It's all coming around. That was like the late 90s, so I guess we still had vinyl around then, right? So when did Kurt Cobain end his life?
In the early 90s, like 92, 93.
Early 90s, okay. Yeah, so,
Yeah, I stopped buying vinyl in the late 80s. I was all CD it's actually when I moved to California. Yeah, when I moved to California, I didn't bring any of my vinyl with me.
Right.
I only brought CDs with me.
Right.
And that was 91, so I had already switched over or started to switch over by then.
Yeah, I think I did the same. I moved to Vancouver in 96, and I don't think I took any albums with me. Probably just CDs and stuff.
I mean, here's the best example. So I think we can all agree that Taylor Swift definitely does not predate the end of vinyl as a thing, right?
Well, Oasis is one, right? Oasis is a band too, right?
So you mean her life does not predate?
I don't think so. She's super young. I'm like Taylor Swift lover, Target exclusive vinyl 2-disc color set, $24.99 at Target.
Is that like a new one or an old one?
I mean, the meta point is that there's no way that Taylor Swift was around. It wasn't like this album came out on vinyl originally, right?
Is she even 30, Taylor Swift? I have no idea.
I think so.
But she's probably pretty close to it by now. She is
30 years old, yeah.
Wow.
30 years old. So she was born in 1990.
December 13th, 1989.
So, yeah, there was still some... Oh, in 89. Okay, there was still some vinyl around back then.
Yeah, but like Oasis. Did Oasis is, What's the Story, Morning Glory? Was that ever on vinyl? It is now, but was it on vinyl back then? Yeah, it drives me crazy. Like the albums that we bought in the 70s are now like you can buy them on vinyl, reissued. Actually, I think there was a cutoff period. Like I think I heard it was like 75 was when they changed the formula that for most vinyl, and it went down. There's a podcast I listened to called The Ongoing History of New Music. He covered a whole thing on whether you can hear the difference between vinyl and CD and stuff like that, and MP3s and stuff, right? So
yeah, but were you bummed out that they had reissued them? them?
Me?
Yeah, from like
only
a collector
from the point of
standpoint.
view. Yeah, like these are albums that I would have, if I had a record player, I would buy these today. Like, like say Dark Side of the Moon or Wish You Were Here.
You would actually buy them on vinyl?
Yeah. I can hear the difference. I don't know about you. And same as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I would buy that on vinyl. I have it on vinyl.
You can hear the difference between vinyl and a FLAC recording.
I don't know what a FLAC recording is, but I'm talking about CDs.
It's FLAC.
CDs, yeah.
Yeah. So CDs are pretty good quality.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure it's about.
Yeah, they're not.
I'm not even sure it's about quality.
Well,
I think it's about how they were mastered. That Tim knows what the master sounded like for the vinyl record, and
that's true. Yeah, so it's that's actually quite possible. Yeah, if they
there's one thing about like Dark Side of the Moon, for instance, David Gilmour has said that the number of times they had to transfer from tape to tape to tape to tape to actually make the album, by the time it got to the actual vinyl, it did not sound the same as what it sounded like on the original master tapes, right? And then I think like 10 years ago or so, or 20 years ago, they went back into those master tapes and took them and made CDs out of them, right? So all these digitally remastered stuff that you see that artists come out with, those are generally going back to the original master tapes. And so it's like analog to digital as opposed to analog to analog to analog to digital. Every time you went from tape to tape, you degraded the quality of the recording, right? Just in the nature of the fact you're writing on Rust, but yeah, so it's kind of, it's arguable as to whether like a remastered CD or like the Beatles remasterings are apparently phenomenal compared to what we actually ever were able to buy on vinyl, right?
Yeah, it's still hard to believe from a science and engineering point of view that just the act of sampling and converting to digital degrades the sound in any way that you can hear, that a human can hear.
Yeah, I don't know.
People are throwing stuff at the screen, I know, but there are a lot of or not the screen. Whatever.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Stop beating up your phones. It's not their fault.
The simple answer is just look up the Nyquist theorem, right? So you've got all the frequencies there that you can hear. Yeah, the CDs are at 44.1 for a reason, 44.1 kilohertz, because if you sample at whatever frequency you sample at, there's a fundamental theorem that says whatever frequency you sample at will reproduce frequencies up to half that precisely.
Right. Okay.
So when you sample at 44.1, that means you get up to roughly 22 kilohertz precisely, just from the sampling process.
Okay.
So you should be able to reproduce the signal precisely up to 22 kilohertz. And human hearing only goes up to, if you're young, at best 20 kilohertz. Right. Someone a little bit older in our age range, we're lucky if we get much over 10 kilohertz. So just from a pure sampling conversion to digital point of view, I don't believe that there's any hearable difference, any difference between a CD and vinyl.
Well, so
now, having said that, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on in between the point where it comes off the record or the CD by the time it gets into your ear, right? It's going through a whole different set of amplifiers, potentially different speakers, potentially if you're remembering your old system, and everything has a certain frequency response built into it. So if they did optimize, this goes into the mastering that Jaime was talking about. If they did optimize the sound to sound really good on vinyl, they tailored the sound to sound really good on vinyl. Then if you reproduce that same thing, it's in a more modern, cleaner amplification environment. You're going to get all those tricks they did to optimize for the honestly crappier sound environment. Yeah, and those tricks might actually make it sound worse when you play it through a pristine amplification system.
Right. So the thing, but the thing that I agree with you that so if you're taking the source, the original sound source, and you're putting it on vinyl, taking the original sound source, putting it on sort of digital media of some type, or sampling it into some digital media, right? That's one thing. The other thing is that on a vinyl record, you have like physical grooves, right? That and the grooves determine the volume, the pitch, and like the sort of bass timbre and all that kind of stuff, right? Then you have a needle, right? That goes into that needle sits in that groove, and it goes into like the needle's held in a magnetic field, and it takes those as it travels through the grooves and creates a magnetic sound by moving a coil in the I forget what we call the stylus head, right? And then that goes into a stereo system, which is made of wood and whatever. And it has equalization, and it has tubes and things like like that. So there's kind of a different set. I think it's the warmth of what we call, maybe I'll do air quotes here for this, but the warmth of a vinyl record, that it's not the record itself that's recorded, it's not ones and zeros, but the equivalent, the mechanical version of it, ones and zeros, right? It's not that's different than what it is, but it's how the sound is actually reproduced in that mechanical transference, right? Like, because you could grab a little, those little cheap suitcase style record players we used to get, they sounded crappy with the crappy needles, or you could go and out and get a Macintosh stereo system with the highfalutin, EQ systems and like a glass platen that you put the album on, or the vinyl on, so there's no vibration on it other than the needle moving in the groove. There's all those different things you could do to reproduce a vinyl, the performance of a vinyl record, right, or playing of it, right?
Oh yeah, and that's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah. So at that point, it kind of depends on where did they record it before they digitized it.
Right.
Did they record it coming off a really high end analog system, and then were their microphones good enough to pick up all the intricacies? So did the process of recording lose some of the sound?
Well, there's also the idea of the soundboard too. I mean, like if you look at that Sound City, it's on Netflix. I think it's called Sound City. It's about the console, the 24-track console that Dave Grohl now owns, and he has in his home studio. Right, it was originally in the Sun City studio, and that's where Fleetwood Mac's "Rumors" was recorded. Tom Petty's "Damned to Torpedoes" was recorded. Nirvana's albums, In Vitro and another one, were recorded there on that same board, right? And is it coincidental that 3 albums from 3 different decades are like majorly recognized as masterpieces?
Sure, yeah, no doubt that contributes to how good the sound is. But that's sort of independent, right? Because the whatever you record onto the CD is after all that.
So right? here's another thing that I've noticed about this particular show people are listening to right now, right? Like by the time this comes out, it will be an MP3 at 44.1 kilohertz, blah blah blah, right? So we're
Well, MP3s aren't at 44. MP3s are compressed.
Well, okay. So let me back up. So currently, Jaime and I are recording at 4,800 kilobits per second, or kilohertz, right? And you're because we record you on Zoom, you come in at a little less than that. But I sample you up to 48, right? So I do the mix down at 48, and I hear the quality of the sound at 48, or the sound of our voices and the timbre and all that kind of stuff, and it sounds pretty clear, to me, right? Then I take it from once I've done the first sort of mix down, and I get all the hiccups and do some editing and stuff like that, and move people around and stuff like that. I take that and I bounce it down to 44.1 kilohertz, because the original master that I did for the show from the very beginning was at 44.1. So I have to dumb this down, right? And I notice a difference in sound already once I bounce down to that lower sample rate, right? Why? I don't know. Then I take it, once I edit the whole thing and I put in the theme music and all that kind of stuff and do the final edit and chop and put move things around in the show and change the order and stuff like that, I bounce that down to an MP3, right? I guess it's 64, right? 64. I have to look at the settings in there, but between those 3 bounces, I notice a huge difference in the sound of our recording. Like if I could produce this show at 4,800 kilohertz and just send it out like that, it would sound phenomenal. But of course, the file would be huge and would take forever to download, and relatively speaking. And we wouldn't be able to store it on the server that we're storing it on. But so how does that happen? How do I notice the difference in sound?
So sorry, I got distracted by something as you were talking. That did you say you compress it?
Well, yeah. I mean, when I'm let me just open up a Logic here. When I'm bouncing it down, because I have a certain requirement that we can't have too big a file. I'm going to stop talking for a minute because my Logic might go weird on my because it fires up core audio. So let's see. I've got last week's show here, and what I normally do is I bounce it down to look at the settings here. So MP3, I have it set for 64 kilobits per second.
Yeah. So as soon as you go to MP3, you're compressing it. You're compressing the sound.
Am I? Okay.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the 44.1 or the 48K, what that's actually doing is it's 44,000 roughly times per second. It's actually measuring what the sound level is. and it's storing that sound wave as a bunch of bytes over time. So it's a time domain waveform, and it's very accurate because it's really
so
just
theoretically it's higher resolution in layman terms for those of us driving at home, right?
Yeah, I mean it's just taking the signal and just measuring it really fast. So it's a close approximation to the original analog signal, which is just a continuous wave. But then when you want to compress it, what they do is there's also, whenever you can think of a sound wave as a time domain signal, right? Which is just the measurement as a function of time, right? Which is what you actually measure. Or you can think of it as a bunch of frequencies all kind of mixed up. This is something called Fourier theory that says any time signal can be represented by, if you have enough frequencies at the right magnitudes and add them all up, you'll get back your same time signal.
Okay.
But humans can't hear higher than certain frequencies, so they already cut out the higher frequencies. And what MP3 does is it kind of figures out at which frequencies is there not much going on.
Right. Yeah.
And so you can, if you cut out those frequencies and play some other tricks about there's some of the size is based on how many bits is each measurement, right? So if you use 10 bits for each measurement, then the number of the amount of data that you need to store the signal is twice as much as it would be if you happen to use five bytes, right? Or 5 bits rather. So there's some other tricks that they can play to just cut out areas of the signal that there isn't much going on in. And then when you convert that back to the time domain, you actually get it to be, it's a much smaller signal, but you've lost some of that stuff along the way, some of the fidelity, because you end up rounding off some, the high frequency stuff is, kind of sharp corners and bumps and things like that. If you get rid of some of the higher frequencies, then you sort of round that off and you lose some of that signal. So overall, it's roughly the same because the overall signal is approximately the same as it was, but there's not as much resolution in there. And so you've traded off the size of the signal for some fidelity in the sound. And because you don't have as many frequency components, you can't as faithfully reproduce the sound.
Right.
So MP3 compression is, over years, they figured out exactly what tricks they can play to cut out certain parts of the signal to still make it sound reasonably good.
And save space.
And
right?
save a huge amount of space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, it's the same principle they use in JPEG compression.
Yeah.
Where,
it's exactly the same. I mean,
because if you have a large field of green, right, you can sample that down to one sort of small, rather than saving information about every single pixel like you do in Photoshop has every single pixel loaded, right? But when you have a JPEG, you sort of say, well, this range of coordinates on the image are more or less the same thing, right? So we'll just paint them with one pixel, and then we'll save thousands of pixels of data, memory, right? Basically,
and equivalently, if the sound is exactly the same within 1% for a couple of seconds, right? Yeah. Same note.
Yeah.
Well, in the real world, it's not precisely the same. It's changing a little bit, but we say it's the same within 1%. Okay, we just represent that entire time with just a single number. Then you've cut out that 1% from the quality of the sound, but you saved a huge amount of space. Same deal. It's exactly the same. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
That's our physics lessons for the day.
Yeah. And that's why there's the video formats like MP4 and MP2 is the old one. It's not a coincidence that there just happened to be an audio one, MP3, kind of in between. No coincidence at all.
Oh, is that? Oh, yeah. I see.
It's a similar algorithm. Yep.
So what's M4A? That's just a different thing, different file.
M4A I think is the same as MP4, isn't it? And MKV is actually not a compression format. It's actually a file format that will hold like MP4. I could have those wrong though, and somebody will correct us.
Yeah. And then there's H.264 and all that blah blah blah. Yeah.
H.264 is a whole. It's a different scheme from MP4. Yeah. Yep. And H.264.
But I mean, it's just that the majority of I guess because CDs aren't actually MP3s either, are they? They're
not MP3s.
Much higher quality.
Yeah. They're sampled. They're digitally sampled. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
The biggest problem, the biggest reason that CDs sometimes don't sound good is that you listen to them in crappy car stereos or whatever that just have the resolution, don't have the audio resolution. Okay, anyway, more.
Well, what are we storing on our phones in iTunes? Are we?
iTunes are AACs typically, right? Or or MP3s. Yeah, it's a different compression scheme.
Yeah,
still lossy though.
All right.